κάνεις τις δουλειές κρυφά, που κάνεις τις δουλειές κρυφά και σε χτύπησαν Αλibaba. Ήθελε να έχει ο Αλιμπαμπάς 10 γυναίκες σαν μπασάς. 10 γυναίκες σαν μπασάς, χωρίς να κινείς αματάς. Αλιμπαμπά, Αλιμπαμπά, που κάνεις τις δουλειές κρυφά, που κάνεις τις δουλειές κρυφά και σε χτύπησαν Αλιμπαμπά. Μια νύχτα του στήσανε, το μάγκα τον τσιμπήσανε. Το μάγκα τον τσιμπήσανε, στη φυλακή τον κλείσανε. Αλιμπαμπά, Αλιμπαμπά, που κάνεις τις δουλειές κρυφά, που κάνεις τις δουλειές κρυφά και σε χτύπησαν Αλιμπαμπά.
Hi. I'm Brooke Gladstone. I wish I could say I had a big part in what you're about to talk about, hear about, and what you probably have experienced on the radio. I am so proud of it, but it's not any part mine. This is Katya and Katie. So, welcome to this magnificent space, just like Radio City. Thank you for being part of this community. And of course, you know what's coming. Why is it that you're able to be here? Because you guys help pay for it. So there's going to be, yeah, that's it. Please become a member. It doesn't matter how much. $5 a month, $60 a year, $120, you know, a lot more than that if you want to get special events. I think it's like $1,000 or $1,200 or something like that to become part of the producer's circle. Or even if it's just $5 a month, being a sustaining member gives us some predictability, and we really need that, especially now. There used to be 3 legs to the triad. We still have them. We have funding that comes from corporations, funding that comes from foundations, but as always, the reliable funding, the most funding, comes from listeners. We really depend on it, so thank you so much. Go ahead and take a picture of that thing. And so, welcome to the Green Space. If you're already a member, thank you. If you haven't joined, please do. And a gift of any size is welcome. Okay, at this deeply polarized moment, I don't even have to talk about that. Public media has never been more valuable or more vulnerable. We love alliteration, and in this case, it has really worked for us. We'll get there by standing together. In the meantime, let's throw our mind back to an exciting and largely untold story about shortwave. So welcome to the stage, Micah Loewinger, my co-host, and Katie Thornton, the person who came to us with this special and produced it, you know, brilliantly with Katya, our senior producer, our executive producer. Come on out, guys.
Hi.
Hello. Thanks for coming out to the Green Space, everyone, to celebrate the divided dial and to hear a little bit more about the history of shortwave radio. I just want to give you a quick rundown of the order of things. Katie and I are going to speak about her reporting in just a moment. Then in the middle of the show, we're going to do like a really brief Q&A. Then we're going to talk some more, and then we'll do another Q&A at the end. So if you don't get your question in the middle, hopefully you get it at the end. And of course, we'll be doing a little bit of a raffle for some sweet on the media swag. But first, let's just dive into it. Katie, for anyone who doesn't know, this is actually the second season of The Divided Dial. The first was about the rise of right-wing talk radio on AM and FM. And this latest season, you focused on shortwave. Why?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, when I was reporting the first season of The Divided Dial, I didn't know that shortwave broadcast radio was still a thing. I've sort of worked and volunteered in radio since I was a teenager at a bunch of different community stations and sort of various behind-the-scenes and behind-the-mic roles. But I really didn't know very much about shortwave radio. Like, my understanding was that it was this sort of Cold War era medium, and that was pretty much all I knew about it. Come to find out, after reporting the first season, a friend of mine sort of tipped me off to, like, hey, there's this really strange station up in Maine, and I think you should go check it out. And we did, and we'll get there later in the talk. We get there in the series. But it turned me on to the fact that shortwave broadcast radio is still happening today. Also that it had a much larger role than I ever understood in sort of shaping the trajectory of the 20th century. And also that there's some really sort of strange dynamics playing out on shortwave today that I think are representative of a lot of dynamics that are happening across not just the airwaves, but our public resources more generally right now.
All super interesting things that we're going to get to. Shortwave sounds different than FM and AM. It's like lower fidelity.
It's pretty bad.
And part of that has to do with the technology being really different about how it reaches people. So we actually have a little bit of a diagram up here that helps explain shortwave. Can you break it down?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it does sound different. It sounds much scratchier, and as you might have heard in the series, or if you've tuned in shortwave radio yourself. So you kind of have to train your ear to listen through the static, but I really came to like that. You can hear the distance. I mean, the thing about shortwave radio is that it can cover hundreds, thousands, 10,000 miles, depending on propagation. Depends on things like the sun. It depends on things like the weather. It can cover a huge distance. Doesn't sound great. But the way that it works and what makes it different from, like, if you're tuning in an AM station, for example, or an FM station, those primarily use what's called ground wave propagation. So you can see in our little diagram. That's basically like from the top of an antenna into your receiver. On AM, maybe up to 75 if you're lucky, maybe 100 miles. It's just kind of a line of sight sort of deal. That's how we get most of the radio that we listen to. But there's this sort of byproduct of radio transmission where there's a skywave. It basically shoots a radio wave up into the atmosphere. And back in the 20s, even in the late teens, some folks were realizing that during the nighttime, when this layer of the ionosphere, the lower layer of the ionosphere, disappears because it's charged up by the sun, radio waves can actually bounce off the ionosphere and come back down to Earth really far distances away. And that's the skywave that you see there. And shortwave radio, no matter the time of day, reception's often better at night, but not necessarily, can use the ionosphere as a sort of springboard, as a mirror, and reach really, really really far distances. And sometimes I can use the ocean as a sort of secondary springboard, like it can really bounce across the world. And so you can get halfway all the way around the world with a single transmitter.
So what we're looking at here is what's called a QSL card, which is a kind of collectible that listeners around the world would receive from shortwave stations. This one, I believe, is from West Germany.
Yeah, so this was not from the earliest era. This is a somewhat more recent. I think this is like I don't remember exactly when this was. This is from the second half of the 20th century. But early on, the way that these stations would sort of tell how far their signal was reaching was that they would ask listeners to write them a letter saying, hey, I received your broadcast. I'm located in this place. Here's what I'm listening on. And there's a sort of code that people use to say how well the audio came in. And then they would send that to the station. The station would then say, hey, we're reaching Germany. We're reaching Antarctica. And they would send these beautiful collectible cards back. And so in this sort of pre-internet era, and this is even in the early 20th century, people were amassing these physical collections that were sort of representing their role, their place in this global community. So
this powerful technology that could let people reach the other side of the earth, maybe for the first time, we can imagine how this would be really attractive to governments wanting to spread their messaging. And your series covers a lot of ground, like 70 years plus of shortwave history. But I want to hear from you about how it was used during World War II.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, it's a really potentially very powerful tool, especially before the internet. There was initially a lot of sort of optimism, like, oh, now that we can communicate across borders, across vast distances, instantaneously, there will be no more wars, there will be peace. That did not prove to be the case. It very quickly became used as a propaganda tool. And Germany, in the interwar period, really ramped up their broadcast, sort of starting with music, but eventually, reaching all these different countries across the world. But eventually, they started broadcasting a ton of Nazi propaganda.
Yeah, and actually, we're going to hear a little bit of that. This is a clip that will include some of this Nazi propaganda. The first voice we hear is Michelle Hilms, a retired professor of media studies who's written a lot about radio.
You had people like Axis Sally.
This is Berlin calling. And I'd just like to say that when Berlin calls, it pays to listen.
She was an American living in Berlin. She became the first American woman to be convicted of treason after the war, but she was broadcasting into the United States on shortwave.
Women of America waiting for the one you love, thinking of the husband who is being sacrificed by Franklin D. Roosevelt.
You might have heard of a person called Lord Haw Haw.
The great exodus from Britain is well underway.
He was a British man named William Joyce who was working in Germany, broadcasting on their shortwave service.
The rich and affluent are removing themselves and their valuables as fast as they can.
So that's what Germany was using shortwave for. Tell us a little bit about how the Allies used shortwave for their propaganda.
Yeah, the Allies responded in kind. You know, this is the time when we really get the launch of what became the BBC World Service. This is also when the Voice of America starts up. And so there was really, during World War II, like the war was taking place over the airwaves as well. And it was sort of informing troops what was happening at home. It was keeping people on the home front connected to the troops. And it was sort of seen as a really valuable tool in helping the Allies win the war.
But shortwave really exploded during the Cold War.
Yeah, yes. And I think if folks are familiar with the medium or have sort of passing familiarity, like that's probably how you knew about it. That's certainly how I knew about it. In the Cold War, all sorts of different countries, so many different countries got on shortwave radio. It was a tool of colonialism. It was also used by newly decolonized countries to sort of spread their national identity out on the world stage. And so many different countries, government-run stations were getting on the shortwaves, on these sort of shared global airwaves. And it was really a place where the battle for hearts and minds was playing out during the Cold War. And, you know, some of the loudest voices very quickly became the BBC, the VOA, Radio Moscow in particular.
Do you want to tell us what's going on with this QSL card?
Yeah, here's another QSL. I mean, there are these beautiful, beautiful collections that people have amassed of QSL cards that are always super fascinating to me because they're almost like somebody describes them as like the tourism postcard, you know, sort of like here's how we want to represent our country to these listeners who are tuning in from around the world. So you can find these collections online, and they're just beautifully decorated. I always want to have like a collection for myself, but then I feel like, oh, I didn't tune it in, I didn't deserve it. So I look online and I admire them from afar.
So we've heard a little bit about how countries, warring nations, would use shortwave for propaganda and for information, but some governments also used it for music, for arts and culture.
Totally.
Let's hear a little bit about how America spread its national culture with jazz.
Willis Conover speaking. This is the Voice of America Jazz Hour. The music of jazz parallels the freedom that we have in America, something that not every country has.
In the 1950s and 60s, music, especially jazz, was a key component in the U.S. government's shortwave campaign.
This is the voice of America.
The federal government ran a jazz ambassador program that sent musicians like Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington on tours around the world. They focused on countries that the Soviet Union was also hoping to win over.
So I'm going to make a wild jump here. But after the Cold War officially ended in 1989, many governments, including the United States, backed off of shortwave, which is around when private stations started to fill the void, including the far right, which is something that you get into in the series.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, during the Cold War, it was a lot of news and information. It was a lot of arts and cultural programming. But the need for that programming started to fade as the Cold War started to fade, and a lot of countries began to back off the shortwaves. In the U.S., it's sort of a unique situation in that private citizens can own shortwave stations, which is not the case in most countries. And starting, especially in the 80s, just because of some improvements in technology, there was quite a few new shortwave stations that were coming online, broadcasting from the U.S. and reaching all over the world. A lot of this initially was evangelism. It makes a lot of sense. It's in line with a sort of global mission. But starting in the early 90s, especially as countries were sort of backing off the shortwaves with their government-run stations, the sort of informal social code was broken a little bit, and instead of preachers buying airtime, some members of the far right began to buy airtime. because they could. It was relatively affordable. It's hard to make shortwave radio pay. You know, advertising feeds a lot of commercial radio, but it's hard to market to a global audience, especially before the internet is around. What are you going to sell, folks? And so the model basically is sort of like, we'll give us money, you give us money, we'll pay your program. And so members of the sort of burgeoning far right began to buy time on shortwave radio.
And so we're going to hear a little bit from an episode where you get into how the militia movement really kind of picked up with the help of shortwave. Here is a man named Mark Kornke.
Now, I did some basic math the other day, not New World Order math, and I found that using the old-style math, you can get about 4 politicians for 120 foot of rope. Always try and find a willow tree. The entertainment will last longer.
He had wild theories that the UN had stationed thousands of Gurkhas, who were these specialized British soldiers from Nepal and Burma, in Michigan to take over the U.S.
This is J.R. Lind. Years ago, he wrote a story for Nashville's Alt Weekly about WWCR and its reputation for having a wide open door when it came to who could get on the air.
That attracted some more conspiracists, if for no other reason than this was a place where they could broadcast, right? They weren't going on CBS News.
So, I mean, that guy's just talking about hanging politicians, and that just flies on the shortwaves?
Not a lot of folks are tuning in necessarily, definitely not the FCC. Even back then, shortwave was pretty under the FCC's radar. And so it was a place where folks could say kind of whatever they want, and there was pretty little ramifications. As you heard, there was the station WWCR, which is sort of like the first station that played a lot of this extreme right-wing programming, the first shortwave station. But it very quickly spread because folks in the right realized, hey, this is this sort of cheap medium. We already have some of our pals on the air here. Why don't we all sort of move to shortwave? And they sort of reinvigorated the medium that was already, had already been sort of struggling and declining by the end of the Cold War era. And so a lot of these US-based stations started selling airtime to these very extreme right-wing hosts.
What we're looking at is a box of tapes that you received in the mail, right?
Yes.
And so if you haven't listened to The Divided Dial, I think this is one of the very coolest moments of your reporting. You got this box of shortwave tapes in the mail. This is like audio that very few people had ever heard before you uncovered it. You plucked it from obscurity. Tell us the story behind this box of tapes and what you discovered.
Yeah, this box of tapes was sort of an unusual story. So while there was a lot of US-based stations that were broadcasting this far-right programming, there was a station down in Costa Rica that was where the station owners and operators were listening to all of these international broadcasts and hearing this right-wing movement sort of growing on shortwave before even a lot of people within the US were aware of its growth, or at least in the mainstream in the US were aware of its growth. And so they started to record these broadcasts that they would hear. This is a station called Radio for Peace International, so they had a very different mission. And they started to record these broadcasts that they would hear. They would research who the broadcasters were, and they would sort of rebroadcast some of it and expose some of their funding streams, their connections to various neo-Nazi groups, things like this. And they started a program called the Far Right Radio Review. And I found this listed in a book that was published in the 90s, and they had, in the book, there was an appendix that was like a schedule of Radio for Peace International that week, or whatever it was. And I saw a name listed in the bottom of somebody who worked there at the time in the 90s who was involved with this show, the Far Right Radio Review, and I was able to track him down, asked if he would be open to talking with me about what that was like, hearing this sort of militia movement and extremist movement growing on the shortwaves in the 90s. And he still had some of the recordings of this show. As far as I know, these are the only ones. And so I was able to digitize them and hear some of what they were hearing at the time and include it in the episode.
So this is like anti-fascist programming over the airwaves, like finding hosts and white nationalists, militia leaders, neo-Nazi recruiters, propagandists, and trying to out them, trying to counter their programming.
Exactly. And it was really interesting because they had a call-in component as well. And it was really neat to listen to. Some of them made it into the series, but I got to hear so many, which was such a gift. But so many callers were sort of expressing genuine confusion or sort of curiosity. You could imagine that folks might have been tuning around to other programs and might have been susceptible to some of this programming, but then they also came across this program and called in with very vulnerable, honest questions, and the hosts handled it wonderfully, and sort of it was pretty remarkable to hear.
To describe the feeling, tell us about some of the tape. What was some of the most shocking, intriguing moments that you found?
Yeah, I mean, I love the archives, and one of the reasons I love working in audio is just the way that you can bring history to life. I'm a huge history nerd, but being able to actually hear voices from a different era, I think, is such a big part of why I love to do what I do. So to be able to digitize something that had never been digitized before, to know that the station even existed, sort of in this sea of extremist programming, was really a beautiful thing. And I saw this through line, from their tape, where they were sort of still hopeful about the medium of shortwave, almost sort of against all odds. It reminded me of the early optimism of the medium, but one that was a bit more informed and a bit more active, because they were actively responding to the things that they didn't like hearing on the shortwaves.
So you had a group of guys trying to program this, to combat this growing movement of militia, white nationalist, neo-Nazi activity on shortwave. There was, but naturally they couldn't really compete. And there ended up actually being a shortwave connection to the Oklahoma City bombing?
Yeah, I mean, the right-wing programming was better funded. It was on more stations. And before a lot of people knew what the militia movement was within the U.S., it had been growing on shortwave for many, many years. And Timothy McVeigh was an avid shortwave listener. There were rumors that he may have even served as a bodyguard for Mark Warnke, who you heard earlier in a clip, also known as Mark from Michigan, from his call-in moniker. And so that's kind of what put shortwave on the map for a lot of people in the U.S.
There was kind of like a moral panic, right, after the Oklahoma City bombing about shortwave.
Yeah, it was super brief, but for a couple of weeks there, it was like, it's like, this is all happening on shortwave. What is this medium? And then people moved on, but it did bring more listeners to shortwave, including people who were curious about the militia movement, and a lot of them stuck around. And in the aftermath of the Oklahoma City bombing, militia programming and far-right programming increased a lot on shortwave radio. There was a station, that station WWCR, the one that sort of started with the far-right programming. They got up to 4 different transmitters. That's something that makes shortwave different from AM and FM. You can have multiple transmitters that are broadcasting different material at the same time. So they had 4 24/7 frequencies. It really grew in the aftermath of the Oklahoma City bombing, that far-right programming.
So I want to kind of take us into the internet age. But before we get closer to the present, we thought we would take a few questions for anyone who wants to ask Katie a little bit more about the pre-internet history of shortwave. Please raise your hand, and somebody will come bring you a microphone. Because we're short on time, I just ask you be mindful, and just to make sure there's time for other people as well. There's a question here.
Yeah, I was really shocked to learn about. It was the Colorado Convention. I know it had a formal name to it, and then after I listened to your broadcast, I searched it and it was on Wikipedia, and I'm like, oh my God, how come I never knew about this? But this idea of all these hate groups coming together and agreeing to basically unite the right way back in the day. So is that actually more well known within the rightosphere, or why? How come I never heard of it?
That's a great question, and I wasn't super familiar with it prior to this reporting. They touched on it in the series No Compromise, which is a great series about the history of sort of the gun rights movement. But it was called the Rocky Mountain Rendezvous for folks who haven't heard this yet. And this was this meeting in the aftermath of Ruby Ridge, wherein this pastor who ended up going on to have a very long and very far-reaching and prolific shortwave radio broadcasting career, called together all these different sort of factions of the right, called together ultra-conservative Christians and neo-Nazi groups, and sort of Christian identitarians, they would call themselves, white nationalists, gun rights folks, groups that had been previously pretty disconnected. And they called this meeting in the aftermath of Ruby Ridge and sort of said, like, look at the federal government's response to this was wildly inappropriate. It was bungled, which was, there's a decent amount of consensus around that. But they used that to really bring together these previously separate divisions of the right. And this was also around the time that pastor who called that conference together got on shortwave radio. And it sort of sent this message, this is sort of the medium of choice for us. And I think it's interesting to think about the fact that it takes a very strategic effort to unite those factions. It doesn't necessarily happen on accident, and there's a lot of strategy involved.
Any other questions? I see a hand here.
Hi. I just wondered, who are the people that own shortwave radios? Because it seems like it might be a self-selecting group of people who love radio and are hobbyists, but also preppers or people who don't trust the government. So I wonder if the programming feeds the people who have the shortwave to begin with, if that's what they'd be looking for.
I think that's a really interesting question, and some of what we'll talk about as we get to the more sort of present-day reporting, I think we'll come back to that a little bit. But I will say that we had some ways to gather information about who was listening, and I went into it very much assuming that it's largely very skeptical folks, very preppers, things like this, and that certainly exists, but overwhelmingly, it is folks who love radio, who love the technology, people like me. I've become like a fan, almost sort of in spite of some of the content that remains on shortwave today, of the experience of listening to shortwave radio and picking up stations from around the world. I mean, it truly is a magical experience. And as we'll talk about a little bit more at the end, not everybody who loves the medium, in fact, a lot of people who love the medium don't necessarily love the content that's on it and want to hear something different.
Okay, I think we got time for one more. Yep.
So my...
How'd you turn it on? You're good. Just talk. Okay.
Is it on? Oh, great. Sorry. This is a very basic question, so because I am not a shortwave person, so my apologies for that. But can you just explain a little bit, like, how does one get a shortwave station? Who do you buy it from? Like, who's overseeing it if it is international? Like, you mentioned the FCC, but just what is the kind of structure or like infrastructure for this whole enterprise?
Yeah, great question, and also something we sort of touch on in the final episode, because it is international airwaves, right? Like, this has to be a shared resource, and so there is an international body that is sort of made up of, there's a volunteer group that gathers from all these different countries around the world, almost like a sort of shortwave radio UN, and decides, like, you'll be on this frequency at this time, you'll be on this one, and we'll arrange it based on where the sun's going to be. It's kind of this, like, surprisingly harmonious process to make sure, because nobody wins when there's interference, right? Like, if folks want to be heard, you have to share the airwaves, which I suppose is a good metaphor as well. But, within the U.S. station, it's actually a law that stations that are broadcasting from the U.S. are supposed to serve a primarily international audience. It's not really enforced, especially in the 90s and the 80s and 90s when these new stations were getting on the air and the right was really rising on shortwave. There was a lot of evidence that a lot of the stations that had come up were mostly domestic, like they were mostly reaching a U.S.-based audience, hence fueling a U.S.-based militia movement. But it is in theory regulated by the FCC, but as we'll see on a later slide, they are regulating a lot of things on the radio spectrum. So it often sort of goes unnoticed.
All right, let's dive back into it. To tell the story of shortwave in the internet era, you went up to Maine to visit a station called WBCQ. What made you want to go up there to report on this?
Yeah, so this was sort of the story that tipped me off to the present day operations of shortwave more broadly. And WBCQ is a station that started in 1998. So it started sort of, somewhat comfortably into the early internet era. There's a sort of idea out there, partially true, that the internet killed shortwave radio. Shortwave was this instantaneous international way to connect, and all of a sudden we had a much more reliable way to do that, and a much more accessible way to do that. But shortwave, a lot of shortwave stations closed, a lot of the listenership really sort of plummeted. But shortwave did persist into the internet era, including some of these US-based private stations, including WBCQ, which is a station that I was able to go up to report at. WBCQ sort of started by this former pirate radio guy who had launched a pirate ship off the coast of Long Beach.
A literal pirate
yes. ship, yeah. And he was playing all this, his idea was like, peace, love, and understanding through free speech. And he was playing all this rock and roll, and like the Ramones were sending him records, all this stuff. And they were broadcasting for listeners up and down the coast. And he was like a lifelong pirate radio guy. And he decided after he was arrested on that pirate ship, this is in 1987, that he wanted to go legit. Like he was like, if I want to get on the airwaves, I got to do this legit. I got to get a real license. And he got a shortwave broadcast license because he wanted to reach the whole world. Why not? And but very quickly, his station, which he launched in 1998. This is in the 90s. This is a time when a lot of private shortwave stations were funded by either preaching or right-wing extremist content. And so, you promote yourself as a haven for free speech on the shortwaves, and obviously that's sort of who comes to his station. And so he sort of had this scrappy, sort of a ramshackle operation that ended up, there was definitely some interesting music programming, some fun talk, conversation, but relatively quickly went sort of the same way, maybe even more extreme as some of the earlier 90s era shortwave stations.
And the founder administrator of WBCQ, Alan Weiner, is somebody you actually visited and spoke with, and
Yes.
We're going to hear a little bit about your reporting after talking with him.
Folks bought airtime to play niche music shows, classic rock, deep cuts, even old wax cylinders and 78s. But as Alan quickly discovered, when you advertise yourself as a haven for free speech on a medium that was already home to militia leaders and extremists, that's who shows up.
The American Nazi Party. Do you know they were one of the first people to sign up with us? They came to us, free speech? Right on the air.
Yeah, and he put them on the air. He put many others on the air. Ultimately, that show in particular, he did pull off the air, but it was the only time he ever pulled a show off the air. And more people came to him. The KKK came to him. He sold them airtime. People who were calling very explicitly for violence, for murder, for killing politicians, killing LGBTQ people. So eventually, whether it was a sort of need to sell airtime, maybe in combination with his own sort of crystallizing free speech absolutism, a lot of the programming on this station, not all of it, but a lot of the programming on this station came to be dominated by those voices.
So, what I heard when listening to this episode was a kind of like parallel to modern day debates about content moderation on social media. How do you balance and celebrate free expression without creating a space for hate and radicalization? In this case, Alan, despite being a free speech absolutist, ultimately had to take the Nazi Party show off the air because they were threatening to kill people, saying horrible things about the Jews. After speaking with him and kind of hearing his rationale for this mission, did you feel like the free speech station was it a virtuous goal? Was it misguided? Was it naive?
Yeah, I think that's I think it's sort of all of those things in a way. Although he took that show off the air because it was calling for violence and calling for murder, there were plenty of other people who continued to call for murder and continued to call for violence. And I think this actually gets back to the question that came in the last Q&A about sort of how people are listening and who's listening. I think that you could sort of say the same about like who wants to come be a programmer. Like if you're going to be sandwiched between people who are calling for violence and calling for murder, maybe you don't want to bring like your fun music show there or your fun talk show there. And so I think it sort of becomes a bit self-perpetuating in terms of the programming. That said, I also think that the extent to which the shortwaves are like deeply entrenched in the right is, in a way, it's more malleable, it's more flexible, it has more potential for change than something like AM and FM talk radio, which has much more sort of political, systemic, and economic support behind the continuation of ultra-conservative talk radio on it. And so it's a tricky question to answer, and I think we bring some of that up in the final episode, and you sort of hear me like teasing out my own conclusions as I go along. I don't think that having more representative, more vibrant, more diverse programming on shortwave will be our salvation, but I do think for various reasons it's still somewhat worth fighting for.
So I think it's fair to say Alan's operation was not bringing in the big bucks, the Nazis and the like. So in 2018, he accepted a deal from a very unusual benefactor who helped keep the operation alive.
Yes, that's right. This is a significantly more powerful antenna than you might have seen than the one operating out of a single wide trailer, which is how they were running for years. And you're right. I mean, he was selling programming to far right hosts, also to cult leaders. I mean, there's some really disturbing things that are still on the air. But it still didn't pay. Like, it's really expensive to run a shortwave station, and there's a law that says there's a minimum power output of like 50,000 watts, and so it's really expensive to get on the airwaves. And so in 2018, he was approached by an organization, by a ministry called World's Last Chance, which is a flat Earth ministry, and they wanted to get on the shortwaves, which is very interesting in part because. And I asked him about this, but like, you know where it's going. Like, shortwave propagation depends on the curvature of the Earth. So like, that's interesting. And we talked about it. I sort of asked him, and he was like, well, they have some interesting points, and like he's very open-minded in many ways. In some ways, I would say, and truly, like, I'm very grateful that he welcomed me to the station. I learned so much from being there, and he made himself very available to speak. And so I really give him a lot of credit for that. This antenna was built, it cost about $8 million. He showed me all around it. And because shortwave stations can have multiple different frequencies, they built this antenna so that they could be on the airwaves 24/7. So they have one frequency, this antenna rotates, and so it can beam shortwave radio signals to like any continent on the planet. This antenna can reach any continent on the planet. And it's occupied 24/7 with this ministry's preaching. They were previously like a web-based ministry, and is how they build themselves. And I will say their shortwave broadcasts are significantly more professional than their website. It really is some of like the slickest sounding broadcasts coming out of American shortwaves. And this is reaching every continent on the planet. This is sort of like, there was an old motto for WBCQ that was the real voice of America. And I think it's interesting to think about, what folks who are listening to shortwave in other parts of the world might be thinking America is like based on what they're hearing on the shortwaves.
And this is the most powerful shortwave antenna in the world, right?
This is one of, if not the most powerful, privately owned one. There are some similar antennas that are owned by governments or owned there's like a Vatican adjacent group as well. But it is incredibly rare to have something this powerful in private hands.
Here's you on this reporting trip, sleeping in a van in a Walmart parking lot in Maine.
Indeed, yes.
So you're up there, you're talking to all these colorful characters. Did you feel ever unsafe around them in this environment?
I did not. And And despite somebody's handgun fell out of their pocket at one point.
Accidentally.
Which accidentally, and there was like an anti-aircraft gun at one of the entrances to one of the driveways. But I did sleep in a van in the Walmart parking lot. I went out for the eclipse, so this is in the episode as well, but the eclipse happened to be passing directly over WBCQ, like directly over the station. Perfect totality, like within the 3-mile little window. Insane. I was prepared to just be like, oh, I'm going to record everybody while the eclipse is happening. And instead, I was just completely dumbfounded. We were all dumbfounded. And it was really nice to have that initial experience because it sort of like connected us as humans before anything else. We experienced the eclipse together, and then they took the time to show me around the station. That said, I wanted to come back the next day because there was a lot more I wanted to learn about. And, even though the motto is still like peace, love, and understanding, I knew that was not everything that was going on there. And so I wanted to go back and learn a bit more. So I did stay overnight. It was very cold. It was like 20 degrees. But I learned a lot the next day as well, learning about the history of that station. And, that station, I think it's one of about a dozen privately owned shortwave stations that still operates out of the U.S. today. But I think there are some parallels between some of the other stations. There's a lot of them are owned by religious entities, but it's the move in the internet era was sort of to sell airtime to whoever was trying to buy it, and that was a lot of extremists and cult leaders as well. And he's not the only one who broadcasts them.
Okay, so when we talk about radio, we're actually talking about tons of things that we all use in our daily lives: Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, cell phones. We're looking at is this the FCC spectrum?
This is the NTIA's, but they're very intertwined. The NTIA uses they allocate the federal frequencies, FCC is the commercial frequencies. Yeah, so this is the radio spectrum, the electromagnetic spectrum, which we own. It is a public resource, I want to note. Yes, this beautiful thing that looks like art is the electromagnetic spectrum.
And so where is FM, where's AM, where's shortwave? I don't know if you can even read this.
Yeah, it's
so crammed with things.
Yeah, obviously after I saw this online, I had to go order it from the federal government bookstore because I need it on my wall. Obviously, and it's $16. I highly recommend folks go get it. But even this is even as big as I've ever seen it, and it's still hard to read. So these are all our radio waves. Like you said, radio is capable of so much. Radio is what we use to get data to our cell phones. Radio is what we use to get Wi-Fi, to make phone calls, to watch TV. And so the FCC and the NTIA regulate all of these, delegate all of these stretches of frequencies for these different uses. So here's TV broadcasting. You have, I know we looked at this earlier, but it looks very different when it's up on a screen. You have frequent stretches of frequencies in here that are set aside for nautical communications, for ship captains. You have AM broadcasting, you have shortwave broadcasting, you have FM broadcasting, you have amateur radio, you have federal use, you have military communications, things like this. You have Wi-Fi and these sort of higher frequencies. And so the radio waves can do a lot. It's kind of incredible, just how much relies on radio.
So the series ends, the final episode is really about two different groups who have two very different visions for what shortwave should be, what it should be used for in the future. Let's start with the first group that you profile, the pirates, the pirate radio stations. Let's hear a little bit of the audio that you recorded.
And now on the voice calling the bunker out.
To be clear, broadcasting without a license is illegal. We're not advocating for it. And if you do it on, say, the FM dial, where there are relatively few frequencies and lots of licensed stations whose owners hate interference, the FCC comes down on you pretty hard and fast. But on the shortwave frequencies, there's plenty of free space and almost no policing.
Testing, 1, 2, 3.
Let your friends know. I'll be down there. Relaying action.
Radio.
So, of the stations that you listened to for this series that you documented, what were your favorite pirate broadcasters?
Yeah, well, one of my favorite clips is the one at the end there where the guy just goes, "Yeah, radio." You know, I was like, that's not really like some. You could either listen to the whole series or you could just hear that. You know, it's basically the same feeling I have. But there were so many interesting pirate stations, some of which I was able to hear, like that are currently broadcasting, some of which people had documented over the course of several years. But shortwave pirate radio has been like really popping off in recent years. There's not a lot of regulation, there's not a lot of monitoring. It is illegal, but people don't really get in trouble for it. It's relatively easy to modify like ham radio equipment, which also uses the shortwaves and is one-to-one communication rather than like one-to-many like broadcasting. It's relatively easy to modify that equipment and broadcast to more people. And so there's just a lot of people who are using shortwaves. And as we heard in that clip, like there is some free space on the shortwaves. You know, they're pretty like underutilized resource within this very messy electromagnetic spectrum. So some of the ones that I heard, you know, from folks sharing their recordings with me or tuning in with people or finding some archives online was like, there's one called Shrimp Boat Radio, where the guy was like, you know, we'll talk about anything from shrimp into politics. And I really liked that. They said they were like broadcasting from a shrimp boat. I couldn't confirm that, but I imagine it could be true. You get good propagation over water, you know. Also, one of my favorite ones was just this one guy on New Year's Eve of this year, just for like hours, played Cars by Gary Newman with just dogs barking over it the whole time, which was just like, I don't know, it's like the soundtrack to my dreams now, is that. So there was some really fun stuff, like interesting conversation. A lot of times people would just play like old sort of golden age of radio broadcasts. They would just rerun them. There's a guy apparently who just does like FDR speeches around Christmas time every year. Like just really interesting things. And it's not just me who thinks it's interesting. I mean, or this room who thinks it's interesting. Like we actually got on the media on shortwave for this series, and we asked people to sort of call in and tell us what their experiences were with shortwave and you know, how they came into it, what they like about it. And so many people told us that they tune in for the pirates and that they hear more sort of musical variety than they ever hear on a big streaming service, that they hear more on pirate shortwave. And yeah, you gotta listen to the static, but there's some really wild stuff going on there.
So we have the pirates who want to keep doing Gary Newman with dogs. This, you know, chaotic, illegal, very fun, exciting broadcast. But as you reveal in your reporting, there's another party that want to use the shortwaves. People on Wall Street. What do finance bros just down the block want out of the shortwaves?
Yeah. Big twist for me. Didn't necessarily see this coming. So the radio waves are capable of so much more than just sending audio, and the short waves are capable of so much more than just sending like very scratchy audio across long distances. We know it's good for that, but it can also send data, like encoded beeps and bloops and code and binary code across long distances, just like it can send audio across long distances. And through this service called experimental radio licenses, which is something that the FCC offers, which is really cool, some folks found over the course of years of experimenting that you can get across the world faster on shortwave than you can on the internet. And so there is a sort of subset of Wall Street folks who are really interested in shaving off as many nanoseconds, milliseconds if they're lucky, off of trading times as they're like sending trading data back and forth from a computer at the Tokyo Exchange to the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, for example. And they found that they can get around the world about like 7 or 9, I believe it is, nanoseconds faster on shortwave than they can using the internet. And so there is a group that has petitioned the FCC to use part of the shortwaves. Right now it's not in the broadcast band. I talked to people who think it would eventually infringe on broadcasting, but at the moment they're requesting a very narrow subset of the shortwaves to use those public airwaves for high-frequency trading, high-speed trading. It doesn't sound like anything, or doesn't sound like much, maybe some static blips, but it's a very different vision for the future of the shortwaves than, say, someone like the Pirates, or ham radio operators who are also using the shortwaves and are connecting, on a sort of one-to-one basis across vast, vast distances.
And as you get into it, kind of just mirrors this feeling that so many public entities are being privatized, and that money and influence at the end of the day will crowd out the good stuff like the Pirates and the music and the wild sounds from the other side of the globe.
I think that's the fear. And I talk to folks who love shortwave radio who think there's a way for them to coexist. And like we said, there is a lot of room on the shortwaves. And we sort of get into what that coexistence could look like. But for me, it was almost more of like an ideological issue, sort of like this spectrum. Like, the airwaves are literally owned by the public. Like, they are a public resource. It is the responsibility of the government to steward them in the best interest of the public. That can mean taking money to lease them out to private entities and putting that money into the government, into our services. It can also mean giving people access to those airwaves. And so I think, although I think there could be a future in which these things coexist, I was sort of concerned about the idea of privatization without a public benefit. There's no benefit other than for the folks who are doing the trading to having traders use the shortwaves. And, something where we sort of end in the series is like, does it matter? Do we care? This type of medium, this type of broadcast that most people who listen to the series probably didn't know existed still before the series started, and has some kind of heinous stuff on it. Like, do we really care if that goes away? And I think where I landed ultimately is just that it's maybe not the most effective place to sort of have a voice and to claim public ownership and to sort of claim our stake on the shortwaves. Not a lot of people listen. It's unreliable. I know that is true. But it still seems like maybe for that reason, it's somewhere where we can try it out and sort of in a somewhat low stakes way, engage with our democratic systems and our democratic process to retain some degree of public ownership. Something that one of the people I interviewed proposed as a sort of alternative to the trading vision for the future, or something to exist alongside, I should say, is to make having a shortwave broadcast station more accessible, to make it so that it is legal to broadcast primarily to a U.S. audience if you want to lower that minimum power output so that people don't have to spend, or flat earth ministries don't have to spend $8 million to build an antenna. Make it more possible, because clearly there's a demand for wanting to get on there, right? The Pirates are on there, but they have to do it illegally. And they've made a request of the FCC to be able to have easier access to the airwaves. And I think just that engagement, that sort of making a demand of our institutions and potentially having success, because it's somewhere that maybe doesn't matter as much as some other places. There's something about having a little bit of a taste of success in a democratic process that I think can give us hope, especially at a time like we're in right now, to make us keep fighting for democracy.
Love it.
Love it.
Okay, Katie, so I told you, you all in the audience maybe don't know this, but I told you that I had a little surprise for you.
Yeah,
this is and you said you hate surprises. I think you're going to like this, but a few weeks ago, I got a DM on Instagram from a listener on the media of The Divided Dial. Her name is Sarah Foreman. She lives in London. I kind of know her from back home in D.C., but we hadn't really spoken in about over a decade. She told me she loved The Divided Dial, and she told me that her late father, who passed away 10 years ago, had been a huge shortwave fan since he was a kid. She said she didn't know all that much about shortwave until she heard your series, so I decided to call her up.
My dad died when I was 21, and I was home a couple years ago, and I was going through a sock drawer, and I found them. The QSL cards that Katie talks about, I didn't even really know that's what they were called. Like, he'd kept them in his office, but it was a really private thing for him. I have one photo of my dad from when he was like 10, and it's him sitting with his shortwave radio, and in the background you can actually see some of the QSL cards tacked up like on the wall on a message board next to him. I have a photo album of like upwards of 100 of them that I have been carrying around with me from like place to place that I've lived in.
Can you just describe some of your favorites?
Some of my favorite ones are the religious ones. They had amazing graphic designers and photographers, like the 40th year anniversary for the Heralding Christ Jesus Blessings station. The Voice of Free China one, super cool. The Radio Kuwait one, super cool. They're all different. They're quite romantic for me. It was really hard to figure out which ones to scan to send you guys because there are so many.
I'm trying to get a sense of what impact listening to the Divided Dial had on you. What did it mean for you and the memory of your father to listen to this work?
There were things that I know were important to him, but that we never got to talk about. And I mean, even the idea that, oh my God, my dad would lose his mind if he knew that shortwave radio frequencies would be used for trading. Like, that would absolutely, I would love to have that conversation with him. And like, he would absolutely be of the opinion that the radio waves are for the people. And that's not something that like I ever got to hear him say out loud, but I know he would have felt it and believed it. And it's cool to know that we would have agreed on that.
So Sarah asked me to thank you for making the series, which has meant so much to her. I saw you nodding along. I feel like you recognized some of those QSL cards.
I did, and there's some that I had never seen, and they're just so beautiful. And, you know, you get a sense of, like, why people fall in love with this medium, almost sort of, like, despite it all. And, yeah, that's really kind of you. Thank you, Micah.
Of course. Thank you so much for this.
I'm sorry I doubted the surprise. That was an incredible surprise.
Never doubt me again. Can we get a round of applause for Katie Thornton? So let's do another round of questions. I see one here.
Hey there, this is great. It's a great show. I'm a ham radio operator, and you didn't mention a lot about ham radio.
It's true.
And I'll tell you something about ham radio. It's not just a one-to-one medium. People are listening.
That's true.
And whenever I'm on, I mean, this is like passive listening. And there are those out there. There's 750,000 licensed ham radio operators in the United States. And there's probably half of those practicing, maybe 100,000. But there really is, if you listen to some of the conversations that are going on, have been going on over the past 4 to 8 years, you will see a shift in the conversations. And you can hear them on your shortwave radio because ham radio frequencies, as you know, are adjacent. But I just wanted to get a sense of what you had found. It's a little complex when you talk about it. But what have you found about ham radio and how it plays into this?
Yeah, well, first of all, before you give the mic back, sorry, I want to know how you've heard the conversation change over the last 4 to 8 years, because you've done much more listening than I have, and I want to ask you that.
So before the first Trump administration, things were a little quiet. But when the first Trump administration happened, I heard a lot of people become more right. The right came out of these people that I thought I'd been hearing before, and they would say they would invent information that didn't exist, right? But they were talking, well, I went to get my car fixed, and now finally, you know, we're really getting to the issues of how much it costs, and they were fictitiously talking about things that didn't exist. But lots of people would listen, and I was very careful about what I said, because I know that though it's a one-to-one communication, there are tens of thousands of people that could be listening to me at the same time, right? So, and if you look at the history of broadcast, a lot of broadcasters started off at ham radio. I was a DXer and listened to WNYC, like a lot of us here back in the 80s. I mean, I was recording new sounds on my cassette machine in the 80s because I was DXing AM, like a lot of folks in New York, right, that really enjoy radio. But it really has shifted. It really has changed. And I'm not on the air anymore. But for 100 watts, the power of a 100-watt light bulb and 100 feet of wire, you can get around the world. Now, you can't do it reliably, right?
Sure.
Because it depends on the ionosphere. But really, there are a lot of people out there, and if you listen, if you're tuning around, you'll hear some interesting conversations from around the world. Definitely. And what I've found is a lot of people listening are in continents that have radios, like Africa and South America would be listening. And I've had some wonderful conversations with people in South Africa, in Japan and otherwise, that are really about their culture. But it really it's almost a freezing. People just don't want to be honest talking on the radio, on the ham radio side anymore.
I so appreciate. Thank you so much. I so appreciate that perspective. And this is something we talked about. I mean, I want to give a round of applause to Katya Rogers, who's right here. She's my editor. The incredible executive producer of On the Media, and took this on top of her weekly show, which is just wild. And I am so grateful always for her guidance and friendship, really. This is something we talked about a lot, is like, how do we talk about ham? Because there's sort of a misconception, I think, for a lot of folks that like shortwave equals ham radio. Shortwave is a not exclusively ham radio. Ham radio operates on the shortwaves, but we ultimately made what was like making a series is always a bunch of painful decisions. We ultimately made a sort of painful decision to really focus in on broadcasting in this season in particular, partially just to sort of keep it focused, but you're so right that there's so much overlap between like folks who are listening to the broadcasts and folks who are out, doing ham radio as well. There's a lot of overlap because there's this, all stems, I think, from this sort of interest in the medium, this interest in spanning long distances. And so I was really fortunate enough to, interview and sit down with a ton of ham radio operators and do some listening myself. And you're right, ham in theory is a one-to-one communication, but you do have people listening outside of just the two people involved. That was something even with like Jonestown. They were communicating back and forth via ham, and so it was legal, but a lot of they were essentially using it as a broadcast service. So it certainly has not a reliable potential, but a great potential to reach a lot of people.
Any other questions?
Hi. What's next for you? What are you working on next?
Great question. I always love radio, and so I have like a million stories swirling in my head about different things that have to do with radio at all times. And I work like part-time in print as well, and so I have a few print pieces in the works, none of which are like public details. Deals can't be public right now, but I am really fortunate that I'm also going to be able to do a little bit of like shortwave sightseeing while I'm on a reporting trip in the future. I'm going to Europe for a story this summer, and a friend of mine was like, I know some folks who live in a building that used to be, live in a squat that used to be an old East German shortwave station. And I was like, well, I'll be there. So very excited.
We all know that video did not kill the radio star.
Indeed.
And the internet solves a bunch of these problems, right? You can get around the entire planet with a server at very low cost. And so it's interesting. I'm curious to know what do you think is the allure of radio, in particular this low quality radio, in fact, that causes it to persist and to even enough to inspire an entire season of a podcast.
I think there's a couple things. In some parts of the world, it is the sort of default medium. Like, there isn't widespread internet connectivity. We really focused, again, a series of hard decisions and making a series. We focused on the US for this series in particular, but shortwave radio is still a go-to medium in a lot of the world, as is AM radio, these farther reaching of the types of radio. And so, one, I think there's a degree to which a lot of folks are tuning in out of necessity. That's what's available. I think then also on the sort of hobbyist side of folks who are sort of interested in the medium, even though they have access to the internet, they have other options. It's sort of like the thing we were describing earlier, of that love of like hearing the distance, like you can hear a lightning flash as like a crash of static. Like it's so interesting to it like situates you in the world, in the physical world and the atmosphere in a really different way than I think we experience just walking down the street every day. And so I think there is something magical about picking up a broadcast from the other side of the world. And we tried to lead in this series with a love for radio, although we did not shy away from criticisms of the media. But something that made me feel really good about people's response to this series was just how many people, even after sort of hearing the ups and downs of what the good, bad, and the ugly of what the medium offers, went and said that they're going to go out and buy a shortwave radio. That to me was a really sort of exciting piece of feedback.
We got time for one more question. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm a ham radio operator too. So one of the privileges you get is you get your own call sign. So I'm KB2 USM, and so I'm gonna put you on the spot because back in '78 I got my first ham license. There's different levels, and higher levels get more radio spectrum. So back in '78, I had to pass Morse code test proficiency, and now they don't have that any longer because it was dropped to make it more popular. So I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you: are you going to get your ham license?
I've certainly thought about it after this. I mean, you hear this in the last episode. It was like the first time I was ever trying to tune in shortwave, and that's sort of like even though I host the series, it still feels very strange and vulnerable to me to like play some basically archival tape of myself is like something I was sort of uncomfortable with. But I think what it does and why we included it is because it like captures that magic of just how exciting it is to hear just like beep, 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 beep. Like when you're actually tuning through the static and picking it up from who knows where, and then maybe you get some indication of where, like that is such an exciting feeling. And that's ultimately why we like included the audio of me finding those things for the first time in the last episode to sort of capture some of that magic. And in the same vein, I've definitely thought about like, I could get on there. Mostly I'm just like, it would take all my time, like I would be tuning through the shortwave dial and I kept thinking about how it just felt like getting in a social media scroll, where I would be like, okay, I just need to see like one more cute cat and like end it on a high note. I would do the same thing where I'd be like, I just want to pick up like one more good station, hear like one more cool song, and then I'll go to bed, So that's my concern is like, I would never stop.
Season 3.
Hey!
All right, thank you, everybody. Okay, so we have some hats to give away, raffle style. Let's see how many hats we got here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. 9783102. These are some hot hats. Okay, sorry to that person. 9783086. Woo! Nine 9783081. Woo! Wow, this is really fun for me. 9783058.
Yes.
Let's go.
Let's go.
We're down to 2. 9783101. Yep. The dramatic pause. All right, last one. 9783099.
Yay!
That's
Great
all
hats.
the free hats that we have. But if you didn't get one, please consider going to WNYC.org and become a member and wear it proudly as a supporter of this venerable radio station. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming.